The Fourth Way by P.D. Ouspensky, Chapter 14. Question. I cannot say whether something is imagination or not, and I do not know how to begin to recognize it. Answer. Nobody can help you to begin. You must begin yourself. You must catch yourself in some kind of imagination. I do not mean exactly daydreaming. You must have some standard of imagination. Then, when in doubt, you can compare. Imagination can take three forms. Passive imagination, imagining expressing itself in talk, and imagination expressing itself in activity. There are lines and lines of our activity, each quite different from another. Some start with effort and go on with effort. Others may be imagination. One may think it's necessary when in reality it is imagination expressing itself in activity which cannot stop and needs no effort. Talking is the same. Some people must talk. Others must do something. But both are manifestations of the same thing. Question. I notice that imagining seems to take place in memory, going from one association to another. Is this a correct observation? Answer. No, memory by itself is not responsible for anything. Memory is impartial. It supplies material for whatever you want. You may want it for serious thinking, imagination, expression of negative emotions, and so on. Question. Is memory mechanical? Answer. Memory itself is mechanical, but the use of memory, the application of memory, the functioning of memory can be more mechanical or less mechanical. Memory is inscription on the rolls of our centers. How to use them, how to find them, how to verify them, that's another thing. Question. Should it matter much whether one knows the cause of any negative moods that one observes? Or is it enough just to recognize that it is negative? Answer. No, sometimes it's very useful to know the cause, because when you want to fight with it, you cannot fight unless you know the cause, and the cause is generally in your own imagination. All the causes are in you, so it is necessary to know them. Question. Sometimes when one is unhappy or perhaps feeling negative, one is brought back to real issues. Since we have been told to guard against negative emotion, I cannot quite fit that in with the system. Answer. You must mix the idea of suffering and the idea of negative emotion. It's not the same. Suffering is very useful. You can get many things only through suffering. But when suffering is connected with identification and imagination, it becomes negative emotion. Question. You may say that man must give up suffering and also that he must suffer in order to develop. How can both things be true? Answer. Different cases, different days, different moments. These are not two contradictory principles. There is much unnecessary suffering, which one does not want to give up. Then there is some inevitable and necessary suffering, which one must accept if one wants to get something. On the fourth way, not all at once, one has to suffer all the unnecessary things. Wrong theories, talk, imaginary suffering. Imaginary suffering is the chief obstacle. Question. Then suffering does not exist? Answer. Only a certain amount is real, but we increase it by imagination. Real suffering exists, but it is limited by many things, by time, for instance. But nothing can stop or limit imaginary suffering. Real suffering, if it has a cause, may be necessary. It may give knowledge. Imaginary suffering takes away knowledge. Death of a friend or grief of some kind is real suffering. But if you identify with it, it can produce negative emotion. And after all, suffering occupies a very small part of our life, while negative emotions occupy the whole of it. Question: is pain a negative emotion? Answer: simply suffering pain is not a negative emotion, but when imagination and identification enter, it becomes a negative emotion. Emotional pain, like physical pain, is not a negative emotion by itself, but when you begin to make all kinds of embroidery on it, it becomes negative. Question: it has been stated, or at least implied, that man loves suffering. Is this strictly true? Answer: you do not quite understand the meaning of that if you think deeper. No, you do not quite understand the meaning of that. If you think deeper, you will see that everyone has some kind of suffering. Say, self-pity. One never gives up the self-pity. It is the man's most cherished possession. He carries it with him, puts it in the best place. He will never try or ever decide in his mind to make an effort to get rid of his self-pity. Everybody has one or two negative emotions that he is particularly attached to. He does not say to himself, I like this negative emotion, but he lives in it, is fully absorbed in it, and everything is colored by this negative emotion. So he will not sacrifice it. For many people, to sacrifice their chief negative emotion would mean sacrificing their whole life. Question: since man ceased to believe that his sufferings were a direct punishment from God, is he not ashamed of them and resentful of them? Answer: yes, it looks like that, but really he will never give them up. When he decides to give them up, he becomes free of them. It seems a simple thing, but when it comes to practice, he finds that he cannot do it, because his sufferings have already become a habit, and so, although he decides in his mind, he still continues to feel the same. Nevertheless, in order to get rid of unnecessary suffering, the first step is to decide to give it up in one's mind. When a man makes this decision, after some time, he will give it up. But as long as his mind is hypnotized by his suffering, he will not make the effort. Question: if he gives it up, what will he get in exchange? Answer: he will get in exchange an absence of suffering. That is why he does not want to give it up. Question: what method can one use to sacrifice suffering? Answer: realization of values. But there are different kinds of suffering. Sometimes an effective way to destroy suffering is to see that it belongs to the imaginary part of oneself. Division into real and imaginary is very useful. The general idea is that you cannot get anything for nothing. You have to sacrifice something. But what to sacrifice? One person does not want to sacrifice one thing and another person another thing. The answer is sacrifice our suffering, negative emotions, negative imagination, and that's all. It is a very good practice, only it's very difficult because one is ready to sacrifice any pleasure but not suffering. Question: how can one do it? Does one refuse to think that one is suffering? Answer: you refuse to accept your suffering and stop your suffering. It's very simple. Suppose you have a grievance. Either you are hurt or offended by something. Try to sacrifice this grievance, and you will see how much attached you are to it. Actually, it's a very pleasant feeling when one feels, I have nothing to worry about, nobody is guilty. But people dislike this because they feel it is emptiness. Question. I suppose the reward of any development is really suffering, for knowledge brings suffering. Answer. I do not see that that is necessarily so. It is true that development means increase of suffering for a certain period, but you cannot regard this as an aim or the necessary result. By itself, suffering can bring nothing, but if one remembers oneself in connection with it, it can be a great force. If suffering did not exist, it would be necessary to create it, because without it, one cannot come to right self-remembering. But people try to run away from suffering, or try to disguise it, or they identify with it, and in this way, they destroy the strongest weapon they have. Question. What is useful suffering? Answer. Until we get rid of useless suffering, we cannot come to the useful. Most of our suffering is absolutely useless. We have too much of it. You must first learn to distinguish what is useless suffering. The first condition of getting free of it is to know it for what it is. Question. Would you say that suffering is to some extent essential for attaining change of being? Answer. Certainly, but it depends on what you understand by suffering. We get nothing by pleasure. From that, we get only suffering. Every effort is suffering. Every realization is suffering, because there are many unpleasant realizations about ourselves, excuse me, and about other things, and there are many forms of suffering. As I said, some sufferings are unnecessary and useless. With some other sufferings, we must learn not to identify, and some sufferings are useful. We judge suffering from the point of view of whether it helps or it hinders our work. So our attitude to suffering must be more complicated. Useless suffering is the greatest obstacle in our way. At the same time, suffering is necessary, and sometimes it happens that people cannot work because they are afraid of suffering. In most cases, what they are afraid of is imaginary suffering. We have much imagination, and sometimes giving up certain kinds of imagination looks difficult. Question. Is suffering apart from physical pain possible without false personality? Answer. Certainly, but it does not become so insistent. When false personality begins to enjoy it, it becomes dangerous. Most of our suffering depends on identification, and if identification disappears, our suffering disappears too. One must be reasonable. One must realize that it is no use suffering if it is possible not to suffer. Question. I do not understand how a positive emotion can be rooted in pain, yet some men of vision apparently attained the heights through physical suffering. Answer. Through physical or mental suffering, it is quite possible. By transformation, every kind of suffering, theoretically speaking, can transform into positive emotion, but only if it is transformed. However, such definitions are dangerous, because the next moment someone will understand it in the sense that it will transform itself into positive emotion. This would be quite wrong, because nothing transforms itself. It must be transformed by effort of will and by knowledge. Question. Can grief help a man to a higher state of consciousness? Answer. No. Single isolated shock can help, because there are many ties that keep us in our present state. It is impossible to understand that thousands of shocks are necessary, and for years. Only then can the threads be broken and man become free. Question. How can real suffering exist if you say that the emotional center has no negative part? Answer. In the description of man in this system, one comes up against the impossibility of describing things as they are. They can only be described approximately. It is the same as on small-scale maps, where the relative size of things cannot be shown. In some cases, in the description of the human machine, the differences are so great that it is better to say that a thing does not exist at all than to say that one thing is big and another small. This refers to the emotional center. There are emotions that are not negative, yet very painful, and there is a center for them, but it occupies such an infinitesimal small part compared with the negative emotions that are not real, that it is better to say that emotional center has no negative part. Question. How can you explain the great amount of suffering that exists in the world? Answer. This is a very interesting question. From the point of view of the work, it is possible to find at least a logical form of solution of this problem. In organic life, man must be regarded as an experiment of the great laboratory. In this laboratory, all possible kinds of experiments are made, and they have to be made by means of suffering to bring about some kind of fermentation. In some way, suffering is necessary for this. All the cells of this experiment have to suffer. Because of that, their tendency is to avoid suffering, to have as little as possible, or to run away. If some of these cells break this tendency and accept suffering voluntarily, they can rid themselves of it and become free. Suffering, voluntary suffering, can become schoolwork. Nothing is more difficult, and at the same time, nothing can create so much force as voluntary suffering. The idea of development is to create an inner force. And how can man put himself to the test without suffering? From one point of view, the whole of organic life exists for planetary purposes. From another point of view, it exists only for the sake of those who escape. So, it does not exist for feeding the moon alone. This suffering is the highest product, and the rest are merely byproducts. The highest is always the most important. We are far from understanding the idea of suffering, but if we realize that small things can be attained with small suffering, and big ones with big suffering, we shall understand that it will always be proportionate. But we must remember one thing. We have no right to invent suffering. Also, one has the right to accept suffering for oneself, but one has no right to accept it for other people. According to one's view of life, one helps other people. Only it must be understood that helping cannot diminish suffering. It cannot change the order of things. Question. Should one not work for the relief of suffering? Answer. As much as one can. But there is suffering which can be relieved and suffering which cannot be relieved because it depends on bigger causes. Sleeping people have to suffer because there is a great cosmic purpose in this suffering, because only suffering can eventually wake them up. If they can arrange their life so as to be happy and contented in sleep, they will never awake. But all this is only talk, because anyway it cannot be changed.